Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about APIs and specifically about API platform, which is a framework that's I've been using for a bit. And so why API platform? So you don't get a lot. It's a product that's been, I think, started maybe about 10 years ago. The 1.x release started 2017, and we're now up to 4.x. You get integration with Symfony and Laravel. Laravel is just new, it's 4.x. It came out in September. You get REST endpoints, GraphQL, customization for other API patterns, content negotiation, standard-based, filtering, pagination, open API documentation, HTTP caching validation, and some testing as well. So not an awful lot really there. So what I'm not going to be talking about is this stuff, which is what a lot of that might be. So, you know, what standards are, why you should be using standards. Fortunately, about 5 years ago, in fact, actually just about 5 years ago, Rob Allen gave a talk here about what makes a good API. It was a very strange event in other ways. That was probably about 10 days before the first lockdown. So, the pizza was trying to work out how to give out pizza in a safe environment. But anyway, a good talk. But so listen to Rob, find out what makes a great API, why you should do it, and what I'm really talking about tonight is how to do that, I would say, in easy ways with API platform. One of the things that Rob talked about, and I completely agree, is what really is the focus of our API. And it's this bit down here. It's that business value. It's your functionality that you're providing with your API. And there's also the interaction, the arrow. You know, how do people use your API? That's important. So you want to make it something that's going to be easy for other developers to use. You want to make sure that it's also performant. You get into those whole things about, you know, is it going to be more REST-based? Is it going to be GraphQL? How do you sort out your caching? Do you send back all of the embedded entities? So if you ask for a book, do you get the author details in there or just get a reference to the author? All those sort of things make up a good API, and that's what we should be focusing on and not the bit in the middle. And the bit in the middle. So when I started writing websites 30 years ago, probably actually 29 years and 10 months ago, we didn't have an awful lot to go on. So you had the raw HTTP request came in. I was working in Perl at that time. You created different URLs by actually having different files in different directories. And then you picked up what was in the query string. And if you want to put things back into the query string, then you did a bit of string math to recreate that. You were getting hold of the values coming in probably very unsanitized ways and ways that were probably very easy to hack. But that's all we had, and that's what we got on with. And the rest of it, that yellow, yeah, we had to do that as well. More recently, we've probably all been using frameworks, Laravel and Symfony being kind of amongst the biggest for PHP users. And in that case, you get your controller and you say on your controller, this is going to be my root. You describe how it is going to be. It's got no relation to where the file is. It's not exposed to the end user, as we used to do. You've also got some far more sensible request and response objects to work with, rather than just the raw $_get or $_post. You've got some help along the way there. We also had the standards coming in, PSR7, and all the other PSRs that kind of spun off from that to try and help us with interoperability. And and also somebody else taking responsibility to decide where security came in and how to do it in a sensible way rather than how we guess. What I think that API platform is doing is taking us another stage in. So the things that we don't have to think about, I don't have to think about a controller anymore. I don't have to think about the response and request objects anymore, because and I'm starting to think more about the actual object that I'm being sent. So if somebody's posting, say, a book, then I'm not saying, okay, I've got to try and get the details out of the request body. It's already doing that for me, and it's giving me a book object, which is what I'm normally working with, so the rest of my PHP code. So, yeah, it's helping me get along with that. I'll come back to that. So, out of the box, what do you get? So if we start off simply, this is not necessarily the way that you always want to go, but as a database-first approach, you've got either your doctrine entity or your eloquent model, same as you would do it anywhere else, and you just slap this annotation at the top, API resource. That's all you need to do. And, oh yes, obviously you've got to do compose or require API platform in there as well. Obviously, sorry, I forgot that bit, but that's, yeah, install the package. That's all you need to do, and you're underway. You've got an API up and running. If you're using, there is a standalone version, which is basically is just a plain Symfony framework. That's what you do. And what will come out of that was, because I called my class book, I will have an endpoint which will be /books. That's, say, similar to your doctrine sort of naming strategies. That's the out-the-box pluralization, lowercase, and with underscores. If you've got sort of multiple words in there, you could always go in and create another naming strategy instead. You get your HTTP methods in there. They go for patch, for update, rather than put. So the idea of patch is that you could send back a partial object and it'll put it in, rather than put, strictly speaking, should be a complete object that gets sent back with the updates in it. So obviously you could patch a full object. It's going to have all the properties in there updated. In Rob's talk, who mentioned that RFC, it follows that pattern. So if you do a delete, then you should get a 204 response. That's the standard that's used. So it always automatically does all those things for you without you having to think. You get pagination, fortunately, out the box. So when you do get collection, it will give you the first, I think it's 30 is the default, but that will be baked in, and then it would be page 1, page 2, whatever you have afterwards that. They do have a design philosophy, which is that you shouldn't send back the link resources embedded into the parent. So if you're asking for a book, this IRI is basically, it's like a URL. It's a URI basically. So it'll be, you get your book and you get /authors/1, because that's the reference to that, rather than saying, here's your author, here's the name, and all their other details. That's a separate request that you can have. You can change that, but they have a philosophy about that going in. And then with the integration with Symfony and with Laravel, you could also then carry on using the same firewalls and policies that you would do for your rest of your endpoints. Those just come in and they kick in. When you're using the get collection and you want to filter, then again, there's an attribute, I keep calling them annotations, an attribute that you can use, a set of attributes for separate ones for doctrine and for eloquent, but they give you certainly the key parts of having sort of possible searches on text or exact or dates. There's some extra ones in Doctrine. I don't know whether what their plan is in terms of just filling that out for Laravel. But you get those coming in automatically. And you can actually write your own. There's an interface, filter interface. So if you wanted a specific filter that's not available, then you can add it in and then just use it as an attribute. And you would also get ordering is also done through attributes. So you could say, I want to order this by name, descending, or name ascending, whatever you want to do there. What it won't do for you is it won't do the bit in Doctrine or Eloquent, which you might need to do of indexing your table. You do need to do that separately. It's just thinking about the API itself. Another thing on the list, you also have to get content negotiation. So they, as a default, they tend to use JSON LD, but you have a number of other options in there. So you've got the variations of JSON with the extra data in there. So something like JSON LD, if you haven't come across it, will, and the others, what they'll do is if you're getting you're doing a get on a list of items, getting a list of books, then I say you've got pagination, and what it will do is it will then say, here's a link that you want to use for the next page or the previous page. Or if there's no next page link listed, it's telling you that actually you've come to the end of the list. So it's a way to make your API a lot easier for somebody consuming it. It'll also be that, say, for example, if you get a single book, it would add in there and say, this is how you get a list of books, and to give you directions through there. So again, advantages in terms of having your consumer of your API not having to hard code in all of those things. They can actually use the links, and if you change your paths for whatever reason, then they will be able to adopt that instantly because they're using what you're supplying. There's also things like XML for if you're going back to old school, and also CSV. Interestingly, if you just want to say, here's a list, dump it out to CSV. Okay, now stick that into Excel if you want. And these use the content type and the accept headers that the client sends into your API. So if you make all of these available, then the client can choose which version they want to use. And it's got at the bottom there, basically they're written with the versions of serializers. So if there's another JSON dialect that pops up, then you just need to write that as a serializer, or again, somebody else would presumably come up with it, and then you just incorporate that into your code base. Obviously, another important thing in terms of sending data is validation. So that's the integration. It uses Symfony constraints if you're in the Symfony land, or you've got rules if you're in Laravel. And obviously there the idea is that will stop at the API level and give a client error back to the user. So you get a 422 error is the one that they provide, rather than, say, for example, if you're saying in your user table in your database that the email has to be unique, and you don't put a validation on, then it will return a 500 error if you put in a duplicate, because the error's gone through to the database and it will come back and say, well, your database is complaining, I don't know why. So you do need to put that in as a validation rule for your API to know this is where the error is. And then when we look at the customization options later on, where your code might be raising exceptions, then you want to be able to sort of split those out into these are things that are 400 or 4XX series of errors because it's the client that needs to change, or these are 5XX series because something's gone wrong on the server side. Maybe the database isn't there anymore, whatever the issue is. Talking about those responses, again, there's a standard, and they use the standard to send back the response. So there's things like you can have an ID to refer to it. You can have a machine name, if you like, for the error, and you can also have a human readable version as well. It will do that with, say, for example, that validation error. It will do that. It will say, here's a 422 response. This is your, this validation failed, and it failed at this point, and it will do it in it's a JSON format that it sends back. If you're creating your own exceptions, then they've got this problem exception interface. If you implement that, it will be structured ready for that, the RFC version, for that standardized version. If not, it will just say, okay, so that's a 500, and here's the details coming off your message and your potentially your stack trace if you've got debug mode on. Documentation, lovely thing. One of the things it will do is it will automatically generate an OpenAPI doc for you. So if you haven't come across OpenAPI, it's a standard that's used for describing APIs. Used to be known as Swagger, and then version 3 became known as OpenAPI. So it will look at your code. So for example, with that book, it will look at the properties of the book, and it will use those to populate that book resource and say you've got a name, it's a string. It will also make use of some other things like the validation. So if you've said that your name is not blank, it will understand that and say that in the documentation that it's a required property. You can also go in and you can customize that as well. Certainly, as you start customizing the code and you're going away from that simple database first approach, then you might need to go in and try and explain a bit more what your API is representing. But it gives you that. It's got, I'll show you at the end, it's got 2 versions of UIs to be able to, so you can actually see that document in a far more readable and usable fashion. You probably will recognize if you haven't come across with the naming of them. You probably say, oh yeah, I've seen that one before. The other thing OpenAPI docs do for you is that they can then be used for other tools as well. So the ones that interest me are things like generating mock servers. So if you put together your API, you don't have to actually do the implementation of it. You've got your objects, you've labeled them as API resources. Generate the OpenAPI document. There are then servers around that you can hand that over to, and it will create a mock of that API for your clients to be able to use without having that implementation. So they can start off and say, okay, I know this is this structure I'm expecting of of a book. This is how I create a book. This is how a book is returned to me, and I can start writing the client interface for that. And then some other useful testing that you can have. These would be sort of black box tests. So they don't know anything about the technology that you're using to create it, so they can't populate your database, for example, in the beginning. But what you can do is, with the data validation tests, if your OpenAPI doc says that this is a required field, then there are tools out there which will say, well, okay, what happens if I miss that out? Do I get a 4XX error to say that that's invalid, or does it let it through? If it's optional, then again, if I leave it out, it should come back with a 200. It should say, that's okay. And if you say it's a string, can I put any string in, or is it a particular format of a string? Have you given that information about basically that translation of your enums into the Open API specification? Have you been able to do that? So you can use it to test out your APIs that you've written to make sure, certainly as you're customizing the output, is it actually matching what you've said it's supposed to be doing? And also you can put in security tests as well, so that if you say you're accepting strings, then do you really accept strings, or is it just the strings that, nice, simple English strings that you're quick to type because you're typing them in? There are tools out there which will try and find ways of breaking into your system, given that knowledge of how it's written. And then, as I say, that's kind of more black box testing. You can also write tests that will set up the database in a particular way before you run through your test suites. So, again, using familiar things of PHP unit, and there's also tests there for Laravel, and you've got some help with sort of assertions that you might need in terms of finding things in JSON as they come back, rather than having to write your own. Or so it will do the cache headers for you. You can say, how long something's going to be valid for. The other thing it will do with caching, though, is if you're using a server like Varnish, they're also very into Caddy as well, which is a Go server. It will also do the invalidation. So if in your Varnish server it's cached the list of books, and you go and publish a new book, it will send a purge message to Varnish to say that list of books is no longer valid because we've got a new book. So it will clear out the cache for you as you update the data behind the scenes. And if GraphQL floats your boat, then all you need to do is there's a package that you need to just require, and then suddenly that API resource attribute that we put in the beginning, that's now accessible as GraphQL. And there's also the graphical UI is provided for you to actually go in and to interrogate the endpoint. So, not a lot that you get out of the box, but I know that's not quite how a lot of our APIs work. So, going past that, that's quite often is a problematic stage. How do I customize it? And this is part of the maturity of the product, and I think partly also with having had to integrate with Laravel as well as with Symfony, they've gone past the great idea going from that software engineering counting of from 0 to 1. I've got my first version done, and it works in one place. They've now had to worry about that 1 to multiple. And in doing that, I think they've sort of come up with a nice way of implementing customized options. So essentially what's happening when you put in that API resource attribute at the beginning, what it will do is it will just use a load of defaults. So by default, they have these things they call operations. And so you get these 6 operations coming in. It says 6, yes. Those come in automatically. So let's say, actually I got that. Actually, yes, sorry, 5 of them. That's why I thought it was wrong. It will give you get item, get collection, post, patch, delete. But they also have put. So if you like put rather than patch, you can swap in one for the other. if you're working, say, in GraphQL land, they've also got a query operation and a mutate operation. That's how that one works. And again, they go off into below that. I talked about the fact that I just labeled API resource on my class book, and it gave me books. You can also specify a URI template if you like, but there's one automatically put in. Again, working with database objects, it's just because I've labeled a database object, it just assumes my input and output objects are that database object, but I can specify them to be other things instead. And what happens behind the scenes with those, they split up into having a provider and a processor, which we'll look at in a minute. So basically that's all sitting behind that API resource as the defaults that you use, and we can now start manipulating those for other things. So say, for example, it is not good practice to always have your API being representing your database, because you might want to change your database to optimize it for that particular context, and you don't want to change your API. So the way we do that is I've said that, again, using my API resource, and I'm adding in some specific things. So I'm saying, because it's, at the moment I'm looking at the query side of it, I need to say, this is my provider. This is going to be how I'm going to get the data. And they've got this nice little addition where I'm going to be saying, actually, I'm going to be making use of their own provider. And I'm going to be looking at my book that I'm set up as my doctrine, in this case, my doctrine entity. So that's what I put on class book. You'll notice there's no doctrine or attribute here. There's no reference to it being an extension of an eloquent model. It's just a simple PHP object. And then in my provider, so I implement provider interface, which basically just has one method, which is this. So my provide method, which I get my operations. So in this case, because it's a provider, it will either be a get item or a get collection. I get URI variables. So that would be if I've got a pattern for /books/ID, my ID would go into the URI variables there. And actually that should say context rather than content. The context is the rest of it. So things like the request objects and the filters and things like that you might want to use. So that's the signature for the only method that you need to implement for a provider interface. And how I do this, the easy way is I would say I want to get using the standard doctrine or eloquent item provider or collection provider. I use that. Basically, I just pass through. So I'll say, $this, item provider, provide, and then just pass through those variables straight onto it. It gives me back my my entity, my book entity, because that's what I've referred to. And then I just need to say, well, this is my book entity. What am I actually going to send back to the user? So I just map those back. So not necessarily with books, but say with, if it was a user, you would have your password and your user database object, but you don't want to send that back in your API. So you just go through all your properties, map them across, don't map password, and send it back to the user. So that mapping becomes a big part of this customization, and such a key part that there is this object mapper component, which is sitting in the PR at the moment. Yes, this PR, which is destined for 7.3, simply 7.3. But it actually came about from a talk at API Platform conference a couple of years back now, 18 months back, where I think Ryan from Symfony was saying, I've put this together, but it'd be nice if there was something better. And you got talking to somebody from the Symfony core team on the way back, and Object Mapper pops up. So there are the mapping components, but there's a lot of work for this particular use case. And again, just making that part simpler. The other side of it, I was talking about the provider. So you have a processor. And in that case, I spelled context rather than content this time, which is good. So with a processor, you have a processor interface, and again, a single method that you have to implement for that. The same three arguments we've got here as we had before. Obviously, the operations are slightly different. You've got delete, post, patch, and put operations that could come in here. And this $data, this is the book object. So the book object that I had, without actually giving anything in here, but whatever was in here as properties, I would get a book coming through as $data. Again, suggestion I would have is that if you're not going to be doing anything else other than just mapping between your API and your database objects, then use what's already there. If you're deleting, then you don't need to do any mapping. You just do a remove. Use the remove processor as normal. If it's post, patch, or put, if you were using that, then you've just got a couple of bits of mapping to do. So you've got your API object mapped to your database object. We'll get it. And if it was a patch, you would get the object. You would then, actually, no, you didn't even do that. Yes, sorry, mumbling here. So you map from your API to your database object, and then you make use of the persist processor, and just again do persist processor, process, and pass through these variables into there, get the result back, which will be a database object, and then you map it back to your API object and send that back to the user. So that's if you were still using Doctrine or Eloquent as your storage mechanism. You could be using other things. Saying here there is Elasticsearch is available as a different integration already. But it might be, say, for example, that it's an API that is your storage. So if you've got a list of mailing list subscribers, it might be that you don't store those locally. It's actually MailChimp, in which case you would need to put in a processor and provider. You need to work out how do you, if you've got a post coming through, how do you add that onto MailChimp through an API? Again, inject a service to talk to the MailChimp API and send that through. If it's gets a list of your subscribers, then if you're going to offer filtering, then you just need to implement something with filter interface. Another common pattern that we use is, say, for example, is action-based. So say, for example, with a book, you want to publish it. You're not wanting to have, say, a published status in your API that you allow somebody to be able to say, what's the status of this book? Is it in draft? Is it published? Is it remaindered? You would give instead a single endpoint where you say, all you're going to say is, which book is it that I'm going to publish, and what date am I going to publish it on? So you just want the date as your published book property. That's the only thing you really want, or maybe some other things. But you're going to have a very restrictive set of data that you're going to pass through, rather than the complete book object. So again, I've got my processor I'm going to create. I'm going to have a different URI here because it doesn't fit into the normal pattern of book/ID. It's got something out. I've got to do something else, so we're going to add publish on the end. And then I just need to say, well, what do you get back? Do you get back the full book? Do you just get back yeah, okay, I've done it. But you're going to get back a result in some way. And then it just falls into that pattern again. You would inject the service. So it's not actually in the provide. You've got that somewhere else in your domain. And you're just picking out what's the information I need to use to pass through to that service. And then I need to just pick up the object that gets passed back, map it, and send it back to the user. You can, certainly with Symfony, using Symfony Messenger, you could send a message for something like that, rather than it actually doing the service. That's possible. I would say it's kind of possible, but I would probably look maybe to use these two parts on that previous example, the output. I'm not going to send any output back. I'm just going to acknowledge with the 202 that you've told me you want to publish that book, and I'll do it in my own good time. Because I think in the same way that you don't necessarily want your API to represent your database, similarly, you don't want your internal messaging to be available on the outside world. Otherwise, again, you can't make changes to your internal because that has an impact also on the external. So I would come back to this version and say, rather than output my class, I'd output false. I'd say the status is 202. And then I'd do it in the same way. So this service might then call Messenger. And I just don't send anything back at all. If you use the standalone version, and if you go around their website, you will see that they're very keen on Frank and PHP, because Frank and PHP come from the same people, which is has Caddy, which is, as mentioned before, it's a Go web server. It is basically Frank and PHP is a Go application with PHP embedded inside it and with Caddy. So that's a technology they're very keen on. You don't have to use it though. Certainly, it looks like there's some good reasons for us to look at Frank and PHP as a way of having any of our PHP applications running, as opposed to using FPM or mod PHP in Apache. There's some good things about it, but you don't need to. You can just use whatever your current Laravel or Symfony stack is and have that running. And then also Mercure is a variation of a server sent event. Again, same people are behind that. I think part of it is all to do with some of the problems that you have with something like PHP FPM, where you're sorry, I should go back to that. Yeah, it's sending an event, but you have a continuous connection to the server for that to happen, which isn't something that PHP FPM would allow you, because it has a connection timeout. PHP has, in that case, a connection timeout. So that's why they've gone down the route of wrapping it up in Go and making use of Caddy, which does allow for some of these ongoing connections. But I say you don't need to do that. There is also an option in Frank and PHP, and there are also other things like Roadrunner and Swool, which have a different way of working, which is a shared memory option. So using FPM, it's kind of a fire and forget, is that you have one request coming in, and then that whole process dies, and the next request comes in, and it recreates, and it gets used. There is an overhead in that, and that's where the shared memory option is available in Franken PHP, which means that you have that start at once, and then the same process will respond back. It's something that does work with API platform out the box. It does depend on how you write your code. You've got to make sure that, say for example, if you create something in your constructor for your class, that you always reset it, because that constructor will only be called once if it's injected into the container. But it's, so I say that's what's there, but it's not necessary that you use it. So what I'll do is I'll just do a quick swipe. I have to do it on time. Oops. Cross. So just quickly show you. So this is OpenAPI docs, if you've seen before or not, which gives me, so here I've got my greetings, which is this class, not that long. I have my greetings, and I have documentation about that. So I've got my get, shall I execute? I haven't got anything in there at the moment. So let's put something in with post. And I've got this try it out button here. So if I put in PHP Southwest here, and then execute, again I get my, it shows me the call that will be used, it shows me the response I'm getting in the body and also the headers all coming through here. And if I go back to my, oops, if I go back to my get, and execute again, then it gives me this. This is in, where's that one going? This is in JSON LD. Is that below? Yeah. Sorry, LD JSON. So if I wanted it as XML instead, I've got my XML version. And go back to the JSON LD. Then I say it gives you the extra information in here with the context totals, and you get different ones with some of the other variations, JSON API, where I am, how many items, how to get back to where I am, how to get to this particular item if you want to see it. So, I think, so for me in conclusion, I was saying at the start that the arrow and the semicircle, those are the key things when we're writing APIs. That's what people basically are paying us for and where they get the value. I think API platform is filling in a lot, so I'm just having to do that very narrow arc that's there, the yellow arc, which is just integrating my business logic with API platform. And I think that's giving me kind of a lot of benefit, and really, yeah, a lot more than actually going back to the whole thing of controllers. So, last one is any questions people might have. Go on, great. Yes. I think that was just / wasn't it? But again, yeah. That's for a single, yeah, that's for a single. It would give it in this format. In the same way as it's giving here. these links. So the links are, they're referencing the server that you're looking at. Again, this is sitting inside a serializer. So there are ways, for example, expanding rather than a link, giving the resource instead. That's an option by just plugging into the serializer and putting that in. If you wanted to put in the URL, the full URL.
Base URL, because I would always be concerned about software which is randomly consuming from an API and then being told to collect something else from somewhere else.
Yes.
These are often base URL, base URLs online, go back to the same API from somewhere else. So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up question on the caching. Assuming you haven't got any fancy shared memory options going on, if you request the first page, then it gives you 50 items, then you say, great, I'll go and get the second page, the second 50 items. So that's what API platform does at that point. Does it need to go back to the database and call that next lot 50, or does it cache the whole result set somewhere?
That's in a sense is not API platform. That would be there'll be Doctrine or Eloquent. Yeah. So you could do it there. So in terms of your caching, you've got the application caching. So from the application back to the database, how do you implement caching there? There's then also you've got the possibility of, say, of either having Varnish or Caddy sitting in front as a caching server. In which case, so somebody would get, say, that first page, they'll get it from Varnish, and it would have gone through everywhere, it would have gone all the way back down to the database, populated Varnish. The next person to ask for that would get it from Varnish. And then obviously you've also got the cache headers that are coming in so that the browser can be told you're good for the next hour. Or to make use of, I think the e-tags were down here as well, weren't they? To make use of the e-tags so that somebody says, it's gone past my hour, this is the version I've got, and then something like Varnish saying, well, that's actually the version that we're still using. You're good to go.
Makes sense. So yeah, like that next record set, just depends what cache in there.
Yes, yeah. And the bit I was talking about with the invalidation with them is specifically to do with the Varnish. So just, let's say you've got a new book or whatever it is, it knows that collection is also needs, not just the book, but also the collection needs to be invalidated because all's changed again. Oh, I'm finished with Tom was.
Have they built in sort of static analysis generics for the provider and I can't remember the other one?
The processor, yes, yes. It will complain with static analysis. So that mixed isn't mixed. It's the thing that you're whatever it is. It'll be my book. Is it expecting? Yeah.
How clever is the invalidation out of Varnish? Do you still need to care about if you add a book in or you update and ads, I guess, are in some way similar, which you probably need to invalidate loads of stuff as a single record, but potentially it's or whatever. But say you updated one, will it know? Does it have a record internally that it's tracking of what bits of caching Varnish might have that in of what needs to be invalidated, or do you have to manage that and talk to it to say what's invalidated?
I don't know where it puts it, but I think there are hooks, because Dom and I work together on this, and we're even updating the database and saying,
by default, it works pretty cleverly.
Yes.
Because he uses e-tag. So in the example that he said about the page, if in that page there is one element, and you do a post on that element, then you can say, oh, there's a post here, I need to contact, and then it's abstracted away by Agnatia or your process and you said I invalidate that, and because that e-tag is in the page, you invalidate the tag page.
So if you've got
for each post, there is a push after from the cache.
Okay. I'm sure you can dream up a complicated scenario perfectly, but it's clever to solve.
It's clever. It's where you have, yeah, it's a hard problem. Yeah.
Does it rebuild the cache with the new resource that you change, or does that then get filled when you think so? Yeah, because obviously there's that lag part of it, isn't it? Like I've got a nice caching layer and now I've blown the cache, therefore the next guy gets to hit.
Yes, yeah, which is, I think, part of their philosophy of sending back the links rather than the embedded entities, because you might have, there are circumstances where lots of small things. So you've got a book and you've got an author. So if the author changes their details and you've embedded it in the book, then you've got to invalidate the book as well as the author. Yeah. Which is back to partly that GraphQL versus HTTP resource discussion as well, is that, yeah. So they would say, you have a book and then you have a reference to the author, and you just need to invalidate the author, and the book stays as it was. It's still written by that author, probably.
Can you get the author? Like if you're getting a list of books, you might conceivably want the author details as well.
Yes, so you could. Yeah, so that's the opposite argument, but yes, you have to do that. That goes back to also their use of Caddy, because it comes. I don't really familiar with. I was familiar with early hints, the 103 return. So, say for example, on a website where you get the HTML page, you can have this thing, early hints, to say these are the CSS, these are JavaScript, these are the images that are going to be used by this HTML page, rather than waiting for the HTML page. Their argument is the same thing with an API request. So you're saying, I want the book, and it says, oh, by the way, you'll need the author. And you could then send that back early while it's getting the book and have that.
So if you've got a list of 50 books, you might make 51 requests.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And actually, yes, one of the things, definitely don't allow people to have client-side specifying the pagination, because then somebody says, not it's ever happened to me, I want 300 books. Or actually, no, I want 300 authors, and you find out each author's written maybe 100 books, and suddenly one page explodes into a huge payload, and your front-end developers say, why is this server so slow? And why does it need so much memory? You say, well, that's because you keep requesting these large payloads. And so yes, so that's the other side as well, is keeping it lean in terms of what you return, because you usually find that how that relationship can change a lot in production, and you suddenly find out sending back huge chunks of resources. So Tom.
How does it handle the more complex validation? Like, say, it needs the result from some service to validate your
Right. That I would do. So either yes, you could, because it's let's say it's the normal Symfony constraints. So you could write that and put that into your object at the start. It depends. That's kind of an application thing. Does it go there? Do you put it maybe down to your service layer instead? Because it might not be, it might be an edge case that you don't want to get checked all the time. And then that comes back to what type of exception you're raising, because you just want to make sure that you can pick it up in that case, in your processor. You want to pick up, this is a client error, it's a validation error, so I'm sending back a 422 rather than it saying 500, something that's blown up behind the scenes.
probably map responses as well, when you've got the actual indication in the field that caused the issue coming back to the user.
Yes.
If you've got your, say you've got your validation, what's the
processor.
the processor,
Mhm.
then like properly mapping that back to the input fields to show the user that these are where the problems. You have more than one problem. I think it's the thing I think about. You know, it's easy to throw an exception when you found one issue.
Yes.
You're processing something, but
Yeah.
showing all of the
Multiples.
issues
Yeah.
on the correct fields.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Yeah. Again, that depends on. I mean, you could catch. Yeah. Depending on, because it's going to be using the information coming off that constraint.
I mean,
The
it's
violation.
so well.
Yeah.
You can inject into this, so you know you've got that. Yeah, it's nice
Yeah.
knowing that.
Yeah. One of the things that it doesn't allow for would be if you, because it has this the API resource is tied to an object, so where you have potentially have different answers coming back, it won't do that at that top level. So probably actually the worst I've seen is where you either got it was for PDF generation, and the API would either send back a status if it wasn't ready, or it would send back the PDF if it was. You couldn't have that situation, and there was kind of reasons why I didn't really want it to do that. But you could send back an object which had a status inside it and a link, or maybe even the stream. But so you could take it down another level. So probably a better example would be for a third-party data processing site when I wanted to find out the results of a job run. From their API, it was very difficult to work out which fields were nullable and which weren't, which ones would be populated if it was an error or if it was actually in processing. So in that case, you could have an object which had a common set of, say, status, job ID, date, and then a error result object, property, and a success object, and a in progress object. So at least you can tell what's going on, rather than, if you like, I think maybe in OpenAPI you could specify saying I want to send any of these three objects back, but that's the way I would do it. Yeah. But that's the way around it. Any more for any more? No, thank you very much.